All right, and my guest is Troy Anderson, Charles Moskowitz, Monday through Friday, 12 noon to 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time as I do this thing live. The book is The Military Guide to Armageddon, Battle-Tested Strategies to Prepare Your Life and Soul for the End Times. Troy, thanks for joining me.
Hey, Charles, it's great to be back on your show.
So we were talking last time about this great reset that I think seems to be the policy of the new regime. It is being, I would argue, obviously implemented on a national and a global level. And I think this is something that pertains to your view of Armageddon. And then we could talk about strategies, things that we can do as citizens to counter this trend. But if you don't mind, could you give us a thumbnail on the Great Reset and where that stands?
Yes. So, last summer, Klaus Schwab, the founder of the World Economic Forum, announced the Great Reset of Capitalism. And later on, Time Magazine had the Great Reset on the cover of its magazine. Prince Charles spoke favorably about this, as did many world leaders. And as you dig deeper into this, there's articles out there that you can read about and different things. And there's actually a book out there called The Great Reset by Mr. Schwab.
Right.
And essentially, what the critics are saying and what I believe is happening here is this is what used to be called sort of the push for this new world system, the one world order, all those kind of things. And
Sure.
looks like a precursor of that sort of global socialism, that kind of thing. And it comes with, it's very closely connected to the United Nations Agenda 2030, which is openly detailed on their website. All these things are openly detailed on different websites. And so, we were in this book called The Military Guide to Armageddon. It just became a #1 bestseller. It came out January 5th. And in there, we talk about that the Bible, predicts that in the last days, there would be this one world system that would emerge for the first time in history to actually have a global government. And so it appears from all the research I've done over the last decade that this Great Reset is just sort of a rebranded version of this. And this is potentially a precursor to this global system that the Bible talks about.
Oh, it's very apocalyptic, and it's a repackaging of the same old utopian, socialistic, Nazi, communist, whatever you want to call it, movement that basically negates God as the creator of the universe. It negates the concept, which is a progressive concept, of national sovereignty, which where individuals have a degree of control over our own lives and destinies, and it totally replaces moral and ethical understandings with those of an elite which hold themselves up almost spiritually, almost occultically, as holding some mystical knowledge that the rest of us don't have. So what we're looking at then is just a repackaging of the same old international conspiracy. And I use that word in the broad sense. I don't know if it's a bunch of people sitting around a smoke-filled room and cooking it up. It's what Whittaker Chambers described in Witness, a conspiracy of gentlemen. Of course, in this day and age, it's women as well, who are they think alike. They're in high positions of influence in government, in business, even in religion and in culture. And they do believe that things like the nation state and individual rights, that these things are anachronisms, they're superstitions, they're old fashioned, and they have to be replaced by some fuzzy idea of this new order, this new enlightenment. And they are now calling this the Great Reset. So, Troy, you have identified this quite well in your book. And you also have their prescriptions with regard to what we can do, trying to preserve our natural rights, our independence in this scenario. What can we do?
Yeah, so something that some people may not understand, and you just touched on it, is that this is essentially a new world religion that's being proposed here. So the socialism, the progressivism, even the communism is essentially a replacement for the Judeo-Christian system that we found in the Bible, and so in which the state provides everything. So that's why this is sort of a utopian system where they're promising to provide for everybody's needs if you just like give up your religious freedoms, give up your other freedoms that are detailed in our Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and then supposedly they're going to take care of us. But that's as we've seen in history, it's a very dangerous compromise to make. As we saw in Nazi Germany, we saw in communist Russia, communist China, all around the world. This has always been a disaster and a massive bloodbath. And so the reason why we wrote the Military Guide to Armageddon, battle-tested strategies to prepare your life and soul for the end times, to help prepare people for what's happening, for what's ahead, for what the Bible tells us. And so in this book, we lay out different strategies, but mostly spiritual strategies, and how to, learn how to walk in the supernatural power of the Holy Spirit, draw closer to God, learn different spiritual growth disciplines, like prayer and Bible reading and fellowship and things like this. Because if you look at the biblical stories, pretty much all the characters in the Bible, they relied on the power of God to get them through all kinds of insurmountable kind of situations and obstacles. And so this book is designed to take you through what the military calls the making of a warrior process, and sort of transform you from a just a regular person of faith into what the Bible might describe as a soldier of salt and light, sort of a soldier of God, doing the Lord's work as we move into this period of time.
Well, you're talking about the antidote to this earthly dictatorial agenda, and that is that belief in the King of the universe, the creator of all things, the giver of the law. And that this is the basic American philosophy of government, I may add, as codified by Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, which is that we're endowed by the creator, not by the state. This is something that they do seek to circumvent. They can't change it because it's there, but they can do what the Fabian movement tried to do starting in the late 19th century, which is to change the meaning of the words, so that we come to identify those concepts as something other than what they originally were intended to mean. And we need to reawaken ourselves to our own limited sovereign understanding under God. We need to know God, basically. And so in case I see that my TikTok audience is just joining me, so I want to reintroduce here. My guest is Troy Anderson. He's the author of The Military Guide to Armageddon, Battle-Tested Strategies to Prepare Your Life and Soul for the End. Now, when we're talking about the end here, we're talking about what looks like a very close implementation of a world order under this so-called Great Reset. And that is the very definition as described by St. John in the book of Revelations with regard to what is going to happen in the end times. Now, Troy, as sort of a both a believer and as a practical thinker, I am wondering, what can we do to stop this from happening? What can we do to at least slow it down by maybe a couple of centuries or even a millennia?
Well, yeah. I mean, I fully believe that ultimately, I believe God has placed the decision in our hands as to what's going to unfold here. The Bible says only the Father knows the day and hour when all these things will happen. And there's been many people over history, I mean, maybe perhaps hundreds that believed that, the book of Revelation, all these things were happening and they were wrong. So the question is, it's ultimately, this is, it's a question that only God knows. So what can we do in the meantime? Well, the first thing one of the biggest problems is the church has largely been asleep for decades now. They haven't talked about Bible prophecy. They haven't talked about all the threats, to our freedom. And now everybody's waking up and going, oh my God, what has happened here? And so, it's way past time to get involved. If you've never been involved in politics before, you've never, been active in your community, if you don't get involved in social affairs, now's the time to get involved. There's, of course, there's this bill in Congress now that would even further solidify the Democrats' ability to, essentially alter the elections, it appears. And
let's be careful here, Troy, because we can't, in this particular atmosphere, we can't talk about this too explicitly.
Okay.
Because there are certain subjects that are now censored. And one of them is discussion of the election that just took place. We can't, we have to walk in a very euphemistic line when we talk about that, because in a sense, what you're discussing right now is upon us. What we no longer have, what we're dealing with a Kulturkampf, which is what happened in Germany in the late 19th century, where the country is being cleansed of ideas and beliefs that ran contrary to that which was favored by the ruling oligarchs. And I think that we're now seeing this happen here. We are seeing a major assault on certainly the Trump movement, the MAGA movement, the deplorables, which I consider myself to be a proud member of. And that is because that movement awakened, which is why they had to get rid of Trump. It awakened faith in God. It awakened an understanding of the progressive idea of national sovereignty, of democratic rights of individuals. It sort of reawakened the American creed. And that is something that has now been replaced by the old order, which is internationalist and which is socialistic. It sort of sees the United States as part of a province of the world, and that we're basically, to be merged ultimately. And the concepts like national borders and national cultures and national language, religion, individuality, these things are anachronisms. They're standing in the way. So let's proceed carefully. I mean, I think that with regard to this new election thing, absolutely. We as citizens need to insist that we go back to the concept of one man, one vote. Every vote has to be cast by a citizen, and any vote that is not cast by a citizen, as in fake votes, we have to find a way to stop that from happening, because that dilutes the legitimate vote of the citizen. And I view this as the civil rights movement of this year. I think that the rally on January 6th in Washington was a civil rights rally, almost as significant, not quite, but almost as significant as the March on Washington in 1963, which was led by the late, great Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. That was a movement which was saying to the public and to our government that we want to go back to the concept of one man, one vote. We don't want to have questions about this. We don't want to have tampering and manipulation, either through electronic means or other means, of our votes. And that this bill that is before Congress, you're absolutely right. Let's be careful when we talk about it, but it's going to codify a means by which votes are going to be weighed as opposed to counted, and by which it's going to allow for all sorts of things that have already happened to happen in an official sense, and it's going to make it difficult, if not impossible, to question that. So, if we want one man, one vote, we have to not only stand up against this bill before Congress, but we ought to support an alternative bill that would implement such things as a national ID, which an individual can get for free and which should be easy to get, so that you can be identified when you vote. And we know that your vote is not being diluted. And I would suggest further getting rid of these electronic devices. We don't need them. They're only in 21 states. The rest of the states don't use them. Most nations in the world don't use them. And it is not that complicated in this day and age to simply have the votes counted by hand in public with both sides present and with everything done on the up and up and under the auspices of the various state legislatures. So that's what my position on that.
Yeah, that sounds very good.
And you also talking about the Great Reset, including, ways to stand up is to oppose this agenda to codify voter irregularity on an illegal basis. Let's just put it that way. The other element of this new religion is worship of environmental catastrophe. Now, I'm not going to get into whether or not we have global warming. I think that that's something we probably do have. I talked to this, he's actually a professor at MIT, and I can't mention his name because it was a private conversation. He was on his way to a global climate change conference, and he believes in global climate change. But he told me that the development of this is extremely minute. It is not what Al Gore talked about, this crisis, the Chicken Little, henny penny, the sky is falling, and that everybody thinks they're walking around like a scientist every time there's a weather change. This is evidence of global warming. It's not that. It's something that is extremely minute. We are having it, but it's very slow. And the response doesn't have to be this, excuse to have almost a state of emergency. It is more an issue of developing better technologies and, that help clean the air and clean the water. And that's something that can be done. But wouldn't you say that this element is a big piece? In fact, it's a formal piece, I think, of Schwab's, reset, isn't it?
Oh yeah, this is one of the key things that they're mainly concerned about is climate change, and it's being sort of used as like you said. I mean, if you analyze the data, of course, there's a lot of conflicting reports. It does appear there's a certain amount of this going on, and just logically, it's probably somewhat connected to the pollution of the environment. But just like any kind of crisis, the elite will blow it out of proportion in order to accomplish their ultimate, purposes. And so I think that's what we're seeing here. So if you read like the UN's Agenda 2030, you read the Great Reset of Capitalism articles, it talks about the need to address the climate crisis, and we hear all kinds of world leaders talking about this. So this is a big part of it.
Right. And I think it also ties in with, in an informal sense, the new religion, which is a sort of a neo-Gnostic idea that the earth is God, and that, the Sophia concept, and that, that somehow, it's pantheistic, and that the earth has almost a spirit itself, as opposed to that God is the spirit and God gives a limited spirit to individuals. And that it involves worship of like pristine nature, as if there's such a thing. I mean, without, that man is a corrupting element on the earth, that we're despoiling the earth just by existing. And that there is a certain, element of this sort of thing in theosophy, which is the religion of the UN. We talked about the UN earlier, and that it's something that tends to be followed by the very, very high elite types, that they reject the idea that man is created in the image of God. It's more that the earth, everything is absolutely de facto equal. We're no different than the amoeba. Everything has to be, and we need to get rid of differences. This is part of what, and I don't want to talk about this either, because again, YouTube will ban me, but it's part of the trans agenda. Let's just put it that way, that there is no difference between the sexes, and that, everything can be whatever you want it to be. And the ultimate goal is to have everything be the same somehow. Kind of a homogenization of your brain, basically.
Yeah, I mean, you're touching on very key concepts. Is that that there's a whole belief system. It's rather foreign to many people, but the elite subscribe to this belief system, and then the Bible actually tells us there will be some sort of like a global religion that'll be part of this Antichrist system that the Bible predicts will ultimately emerge. And it appears that this sort of belief system, which is anti Judeo-Christian, may very well be that philosophy, that belief system, and that belief system justifies all kinds of different things that could be done to people, essentially. And we're now beginning to witness, for initial stages of those kind of policies being, brought forward.
Can you give me some examples of that?
Well, I mean, just look at the coronavirus situation over the last year.
Mhm.
The churches have largely been shuttered, and now there's this great push for passports and different things like that. So, where's this all heading? That's the question on everyone's mind. And of course, the Bible talks about the mark of the beast, and you can't buy or sell unless you have this whatever this mark is. And so, people are questioning, are we moving into that kind of ultimate system? For the first time in history, we have all the technologies in place where you could actually have this kind of system. You have the surveillance state, you have microchip implants, you have artificial intelligence, computerized banking, pretty much everything that would be needed to implement some kind of system where some central authority can control whether you work, earn money, can't earn
Mhm.
money, go to the grocery store, that kind of thing. So we're witnessing maybe what might be the precursors to that kind of deal.
Right, the bark of the beast. You'll have to have like a certain card even implanted into your body that will allow you to get food. I mean, I know that sounds like far-fetched, but at the same time, let's take a look at everything that's happened this last year and ask ourselves what's far-fetched. I mean, I'm terrified over the coronavirus. I recognize it's real. And maybe it's because I'm perhaps influenced by the nightly news where they show horror stories every day. You see people who catch this thing and they're sick for the rest of their life and they've got brain fog and it's horrible. So, yes, I am scared of it. And yes, I take precautions, but I'm concerned about the kind of the overreach of government in terms of actually functioning in the context of a informal martial law that you can be criminalized if you step outside your house without a piece of cloth on your face. I mean, you can take responsibility yourself. And if you want to be risky, then you might catch the disease. I think people understand that you take reasonable precautions, just like you lock your door to your house because you don't want a criminal or your car. If there's a health risk, you take reasonable precautions. So I think that the government has used this as an excuse to experiment socially with shutting down businesses, shutting down schools, trying to reformat education in a way that I think actually is backfiring on them because, now we know what's going on in the classroom because we can see it on the computer. They can't hide it anymore behind the locked door. And maybe there's this resurgence of homeschooling, which I think is good. So, I mean, in a way, there are positives to this. There's maybe a more of a move toward faith and toward individual self-reliance. We know that we have to do some prepping and some storage like they would do back in colonial times for a famine. These things are probably good. It could lead us to becoming more self-sufficient. But on the global side, it's troubling to see governments being, you know, in such control over the most basic functions of what we do, our comings and our goings. What do you think about the condition, the social element of the response to the virus?
Yeah, I mean, there was a Pew report came out a couple weeks ago. It said 3 in 10 Americans are drawing closer to God in their faith amid this pandemic, and so that's a good sign. There's a number of good indications of the sort of unexpected impact that this is having. And that's one of them. Pastor Greg Laurie here in Orange County, he reported like 100, I think it was 150,000 people, made professions of faith over the last year during this time. And I'm hearing, similar, pastors and ministries around the world reporting similar things. In our last book, Trumpocalypse, we called for a National Day of Repentance, and that actually went forward last September. 100,000 people showed up at the National Mall. Millions watched it online. It's called The Return, National and Global Day of Prayer and Repentance. Rabbi Jonathan Cahn is the spokesman. And, Kevin Jessup told us, 250,000 people made professions of faith. Amid this, my co-authors, Colonel David Giamona, he's a retired Army chaplain. We formed Battle Ready Ministries, and we've now got conferences and spiritual boot camps scheduled at churches around the country. In fact, he just spoke at a church in Virginia on Sunday. And we have more coming up in Northern California. We're getting a lot of interest there. So it's, something people could attend virtually at first, and then in person later on as things begin to open up. So there's all kinds of indications that there's sort of good things coming out of this, people waking up and drawing closer to God. And then we actually have a chapter in the book called Prepping for the End Times, where the colonel sort of takes his 3 decades of wisdom and lays out all the different kind of provisions you might need, for any kind of disaster. So, good things to stock up on and, be ready for
it. The one, I suppose, maybe slightly dark note in terms of faith is that many of our churches, and I've done some programs on this, they've been co-opted by the very same people that we're talking about, these international or minded elites, with things like so-called social justice and other concepts which have been used in a Fabian way to replace ideas like sin and ideas like good and evil and ideas like revelation, that there is this kind of like creeping element in our churches and in our synagogues and mosques and other places of worship. And so I think we need to try to understand, the wheat from the chaff, so to speak, and what in fact is authentic and what might be kind of a replacement. Julian Huxley was the founder of UNESCO. He was the brother of Aldous Huxley, and he was the grandson of H.R. Huxley, who was the main promoter of Darwin. And he wanted, after World War II, to come up with a new eugenics, because obviously eugenics had a bad, a stench to it because of Adolf Hitler, and rightfully, of course. And so he came up with this, the evolutionary consensus of 1948, and also this idea of the evolutionary, I think he called it, evolutionary humanism, or there was some name for it, by which all of the religions of the world would come to embrace the principles while leaving in place their trappings of ritual and their trappings of, of formality and practice. The stained glass and the worship formalities would remain, but the actual beliefs, the principles, would become evolutionary humanism. And in that way, stealthily and subversively, there would be implemented this new world religion. And of course, UNESCO saw itself as the World School Board, and that would be the propaganda arm that would introduce this idea to particularly younger people and children through this so-called education. So I only bring it up because we have to be careful with religion. I don't know if you can't totally trust, your minister and your priest and your rabbi, because they might be informally, not necessarily consciously, but informally a part of this humanistic movement.
Yeah. I mean, you touch on a very profound subject. I mean, for decades, essentially, I've been investigating this for a decade. I've written, 3 books, sort of looking at all these different things, and essentially, there's, the elite have spent tens of billions of dollars on propaganda, scientific mind control, different campaigns, and it's all designed, like you say, to change the way we think, to change our worldview. And as polls now show, many of the young people, 50% or maybe up to 70%, have sort of a socialistic worldview. Many of them, because they've been taught in schools, now view themselves as global citizens instead of citizens of their own nations. And so there's a concerted campaign that's been going on for decades and decades, involving United Nations, UNESCO, and different organizations like that, to accomplish this, change in the belief systems of people around the world. And so it's a very sophisticated campaign. So I think what the Colonel likes to say is that we're involved in sort of a sophisticated asymmetrical warfare that is going on now, and involving governments around the world, different behind the scenes forces and things like that are trying to move us into ultimately to this global system. He talks about the center of gravity in the Army, and what is the center of gravity in the military. That's sort of the central focus of of your campaign to take down your enemy. And so the elite are using all kinds of different strategies to ultimately accomplish this new system they want to move us into, and that's a big part of it.
Well, you talk about the center of gravity, and I think that if you take a look at the Communist Manifesto, which I think remains the basic manual of their function. One of the there's I think there's 10 planks, and one of the planks is that you adapt your socialistic idea of progress to each individual culture and nation, depending upon where they are. So, if they're oriented toward religion or property ownership, you come up with a new form to kind of work your way in, and you move a little more slowly and a little more stealthily as you push forward. I mean, an example of that would have been fascist Italy. There was, Mussolini, who was a Bolshevik, sized up his country and realized that Italy was made up of basically small landowners, small businessmen, and that the Roman Catholic Church was very powerful. And so he had to come up with what he called the third way. And that was a merge between Bolshevism and free market as a way to kind of move the country in the middle. I mean, the Clintons used to talk about this, the middle way. And I think that in this country, the way they're going after us and the way they're dividing us and creating a new dialectic is through race. I think they see that as our Achilles heel, our weakness, that we have a path. First of all, we are multiracial, unlike most of Europe and Asia and Africa, for that matter, unlike most countries. So naturally, we have racial tensions. I mean, that's just it's a bad side of human nature. People are tribal, and there's a lot of reasons for that. And it's certainly something that should be, reduced over time, but by, I think, policies that help individual success. But they see this as our weakness, even though real racism has receded in this country, particularly since after World War II and then the 1960s with the Civil Rights Movement. So they seem to be reviving it, and they seem to be implementing it as an educational program. Now children are taught that it's evil to be, white, and whatever that means, and that and there's this whole race education that I think is going to actually create racism. What say you with regard to how we counter this?
One of my ancestors is Friedrich von Schiller. He's the poet and playwright that wrote Ode to Joy that Beethoven set the music in the Ninth Symphony, and wrote some famous plays, including William Tell. Mm-hmm. And he'd already died in the early 1800s, but Abraham Lincoln was inspired by William Tell. It's about the fight for freedom, battle against tyranny, about the Swiss hero who shoots the arrow through an apple atop his son's head, and then he ends up killing the tyrant that made him do it. And so it was a play that was widely performed throughout America in the 1800s. And so Lincoln often quoted Schiller in his campaign for presidency. And many of the advocates for the anti-slavery advocates, quoted Schiller. In fact, Frederick Douglass called him the poet of freedom, and he was a African-American slave activist,
Yeah,
former
sure.
slave activist.
Yeah.
And so, many people may be unaware today, but President Abraham Lincoln was a Republican.
Yeah.
And it was the Republicans a century and a half ago that, so there was actually 250,000 Germans that fought on Lincoln's side, including several generals, including one of my ancestors, Schiller's grandson. And they helped, win the Civil War and free the slaves. And so, conservatives have a history of being champions of, against slavery and against racism. So today we see this phenomena of, using race to pit us against each other, to try to, flare up these, like you said, the tribal, instincts and that kind of thing. And I just remember I went to the University of Oregon back in the 1980s, and there was already a campaign going on back then in the different classes I took to try to multiculturalism and teach us to be tolerant and respectful of each other's differences. And so for decades now, there's been sort of we've been taught to get along with each other. We've actually, it seems like it's done pretty well. But here in the last couple of years, there's been a new campaign to try to sort of divide the nation. I think you've hit it on the head, is that the elite are using this to pit us against each other and flare up these, human weaknesses and target this as like our Achilles heel and how to, sort of take us down and merge us into their ultimate plan again. So it all sort of goes back to this part of their strategy, what is it called? The Hegelian dialectic. To move us into this new system. So there's just massive psychological, operations and warfare being, used against us, via the media and all these different things to accomplish their purposes. And this is another big part of it.
Yeah, and I think that they've decided that the best way to weaken the United States and the best way to dilute our independence is by fanning the flames of race conflict. Anyone that everyone's put under a microscope, and do you have a racial gene? I mean, are you like, there's race identity. Now you have reparations. Who gets reparations? I mean, and if they're successful with reparations, who's going to be next on the roster of getting this enormous benefit? Which group? Will be trans people? I don't know. I mean, the point is that it's a move to create more division and in extreme division, and also to create a society that does not actually reward production and creation, but you get rewarded for things that you really don't have any control over. So anyways, Troy, we're talking about your book here, which is available in all major bookstores, The Military Guide to Armageddon: Battle-Tested Strategies to Prepare Your Life and Soul for the End Times. We've talked about the Great Reset, which is the end time scenario that is now being implemented, especially since this new regime has been installed. And I guess that just to kind of like put a cap on it all, what can we take away in terms of standing up to this as individuals, regardless of if you're liberal or conservative? That doesn't matter. What can we do? I mean, one of the things I'm suggesting is that we run for local offices, whether it be city council, school committee, local state rep, local state senator. I mean, I did it years ago. It is a great civic exercise. You can win. You can get a few ideas in place. We've learned from this last election how powerful the state legislators actually are, but they have forgotten this under the Constitution. They need to reassert their sovereignty and their representative role in terms of regulating things like elections and so many other things. So you can get involved. It's a civic duty, and it's great. It's a fantastic and rewarding experience. So I urge people to do it. Anyway, what say you, Troy?
Oh yeah. That's a great encouragement for people. The more good people we have in all levels of government, the better country we're going to have, and the more freedoms we'll have. And so, yeah, I would encourage people who are interested in running for different political offices to do that. And the primary reason why we wrote the Military Guide to Armageddon is to encourage people to draw closer to God in their faith, and to use the different tools that the Bible gives us, to navigate what's ahead. A lot of people are stressed out, they have anxiety and fearful about what's happening, but the Bible is a great source of comfort, and ultimately, God is going to set everything right in the end. And so this book is, sort of a guide to navigating all that's going on. And many people are telling us they're very inspired by it. People are like going out and buying boxes and giving them away as gifts to family and friends. And so we're getting a lot of encouraging reports.
All right, Troy Anderson, listen, I want to thank you as always for joining me.
Oh,
And,
yeah. Thank you so much.
I really appreciate it. Keep up the good work, and we should be in touch from time to time.
You too.